Right, hello again. So this is the sixth lecture on exercise health and physiology, and in this lecture we are going to talk about the limits to VO2 max or VO2 peak, primarily in health, but we will also touch on disease states as well. So in the past 2 weeks, what we've focused on is this idea of a cardiopulmonary exercise test. So this kind of test of your overall cardiovascular, cardiorespiratory function, um, which is basically a fancy way of saying a test to measure VO2 peak. And this cardiopulmonary exercise test is a term that's used in a clinical setting, and it's a test that we're going to be running in the labs over the next sort of 3 to 4 lab sessions. And one of the primary variables that we get from the VO2 from the cardiopulmonary exercise test is this outcome marker called VO2 max or VO2 peak. And what we did in the previous weeks is we kind of outlined oxygen uptake at rest and during moderate intensity exercise. Then last week we took that a step further to consider what happens at VO2 max. So this idea of a plateauing of oxygen consumption or an inability to increase oxygen consumption despite an further increase in work performed. And then we briefly touched on, why would we have a VO2 max or VO2 peak in the first place? Like, what is it within the body that means it is unable to continue to increase oxygen consumption? And then what we're going to do this week is a further small step beyond that, which is to kind of further consider, like, what is it that actually limits VO2 peak? So, what separates people with a high VO2 peak from a low VO2 peak, and actually within the system itself, what actually is it that seems to be meaning that we can, deliver and utilize this extra oxygen that we clearly require because we're performing more work. And then I'm going to introduce sort of two ways of trying to understand the problem and consider it. One's by looking at the Fick equation, and another one's by looking at the oxygen cascade, which is the one that I'd kind of recommend that you consider because I think it's a little bit more intuitive. So before we get on to really thinking about these, like breaking down the system into these sort of component parts, it's worthwhile just highlighting and pointing out that whenever we're measuring an exercise variable, particularly oxygen consumption, it's a coordinated response. So it's something we talked about in the previous lecture. When we're doing exercise, we have this requirement to, utilize more oxygen to resynthesize this ATP. But in order to do that effectively, we need to ensure that all the different elements of the oxygen transport and utilization systems are all working in concert with one another. So what we're going to talk about in subsequent lectures are where, parts of these processes fall apart a little bit because of disease. But for now, it's just before we start, breaking things up and really considering what part's most important, it's worthwhile just bearing in mind that they're all really important. Without any of them functioning correctly, we wouldn't be able to perform any exercise at all. To take this to the extreme, if you had no mitochondria, then you wouldn't have any aerobic respiration, and therefore, you wouldn't be able to, resynthesize that ATP through aerobic means at all. So no mitochondria means no aerobic respiration. Similarly, to a large extent, certainly in humans, no cardiovascular system means no movement of oxygen from the lungs to the muscle, and therefore there'd be no, no oxygen, no aerobic respiration as well. And then finally, as another example of this kind of absurd example to prove the point, really, someone whose lungs aren't working correctly, the only reason they're able to stay alive is because they're put on a ventilator. So you might have heard of these a lot at the minute because of COVID, partly the lungs aren't able to work properly. So without the lungs working properly, well, no oxygen's getting from the air to the blood, and therefore, people will die. So what they do is they stick them on ventilators that sort of takes care of this ventilation for them, or tries to. So it's all a coordinated response, and you can't really separate any one from the other, but you can start to kind of consider which ones are more important in certain circumstances, which is what we're going to try and do today. So, given that it's an integrated response, it's still useful to try and think, well, let's try and understand which elements are of most important. So our first question is going to be, well, why do we reach VO2 peak? Question one. And so this is a question that's been asked for decades, and people have tried to answer for decades, like why do we reach VO2 peak? Why can't we just continue our aerobic respiration? What is it that's limiting our system, this system of, of this cardiovascular system, if you like? And one of the ways it's been traditionally separated is by considering oxygen delivery versus oxygen utilization. So the idea of this really is to think, well, we could have a scenario whereby, we are unable to deliver oxygen to the muscle. So the example that I gave about, the lungs not working correctly, that would be a really good example of an oxygen delivery limitation. If the lungs aren't working correctly, and so no oxygen is getting from the atmospheric air into the blood, then we are not going to be able to deliver oxygen to where it's needed. So that would be a severe example of an oxygen delivery limitation. Now, the daft example I gave about having no mitochondria, which doesn't really exist. You do have certain conditions where mitochondrial levels are low, but no mitochondria doesn't exist because you would die. But in a scenario where you had no mitochondria, that would be an example of an oxygen utilization limitation, because you may be delivering all the oxygen that you need, but you haven't got the mitochondria there in order to be able to utilize it, and therefore you're still not going to be able to resynthesize that ATP for energy production. So this is kind of like all the physiological components of the body sort of versus the muscle is another way of framing it, because in our case with exercise we're considering oxygen utilization to primarily be occurring in the muscle. So all the physiological systems, lungs, heart, vascular, blood, everything versus the muscle is another way of looking at that. So I've got another kind of silly example to sort of try and make this point clearer. So I've got two daft scenarios here about sweets and people trying to eat them. So what we've got here is, on the left hand side, is this young boy absolutely surrounded by sweets. So if we think about this young boy being the mitochondria, so the mitochondria being the primary place where you're going to utilize that oxygen, we can consider these sweets to be the oxygen. Well, this is a scenario, if you think about it, is what's limiting the number of sweets that are being eaten, or the number of oxygen that's been utilized, is this little boy's capacity to eat sweets. So this would be an example of an oxygen utilization limitation. The limitation of being able to eat these sweets is his ability to utilize or to eat them. On the other hand, here we've got a scenario, we've got thousands of people in a crowd, but we only have one person, this clown, who's giving out sweets. Well, in this scenario here, there's a huge capacity to eat the sweets. So in our example, to consume the oxygen. However, our ability to deliver these sweets to all of these people is severely limited because we only have this one person giving out the sweets to the people. So this would be an example of kind of a sweet delivery limitation, or an oxygen delivery limitation, with regards to what we're actually interested in. So the next question is, well, which one is it? So hopefully we can understand that there are two different scenarios. You could have a scenario where our ability to utilize oxygen is delivery limited, or it could be oxygen utilization limited. And actually in the real world there are scenarios where it's both. But with regards to VO2 max, the majority of the evidence kind of suggests that it's a delivery limitation problem rather than a utilization problem. So it's not to say that utilization cannot be an issue. It can. It can be a certain issue with other elements of physiology, like oxygen uptake kinetics. It can also be an issue with certain types of disease. But in healthy people, the primary limiting factor in our ability to utilize oxygen is our inability to continue to deliver it at high levels. So there's a paper, a review paper by Bassett and Howley, which I highly recommend that you check out. I think it's been one of the recommended reading texts for a previous week, so definitely check this out and have a read. And it basically just goes through the case of why VO2 max is delivery limited, and it gives three really good examples, and we're going to sort of tackle two of those. So we're going to look at this first example, which is when oxygen delivery can be altered, like what happens to VO2 max. The second example we're going to look at is, if you make somebody train, how do the increases in VO2 max correspond to changes in oxygen delivery or oxygen utilization outcome markers. And then the final one we're not going to tackle, but it looks at basically it sort of makes a case for the fact that the muscle mass has a much higher capacity to utilize oxygen than it tends to during exercise. So if you want to have a look at that point, then do so by reading the Howley paper, the Bassett and Howley paper. So the first one, so when oxygen delivery is altered, VO2 max changes accordingly. So the examples that it gives of this are from primary research articles, but the first one is that if we give people a thing called a beta blocker, so a beta blocker is essentially a drug that slows your heart rate down. So if you give somebody this drug that slows their heart rate down, you can imagine that that's going to likely reduce their maximum cardiac output, so the ability of the heart to pump blood around the body. And when you do that, when you give people these drugs, you can reduce VO2 max soon after by 5 to 15%. So this is showing like a direct link between a reduction in oxygen delivery via a reduction in maximum cardiac output causing a reduction in VO2 max. Now another example is where this one related to the blood, and it's something that you'll probably be familiar with. If you give individuals blood transfusions to increase the amount of blood, and in particular red blood cells within their body, you can also increase their VO2 max. So an infusion of between 900 to 1300 mils of blood increases VO2 max by 4 to 9%. So what these two pieces of evidence are sort of showing you is by either manipulating the way that the heart works or manipulating the way that the blood works, both of which are oxygen delivery focused, you can increase VO2 max. Now this next sort of piece of evidence that is probably a stronger piece of evidence to really highlight why oxygen delivery is more important than oxygen utilization with regards to VO2 max in healthy people. So if we take a scenario where we have individuals who've had almost 3 weeks of bed rest. So undergoing 3 weeks of bed rest will reduce your maximum oxygen consumption. Now in these individuals, we sort of set them at a baseline of 100%. Now if we compare them to when they were sedentary, what we can see is that their VO2 max, so here on the y-axis, increases by about 50%. So there's about a 50% increase in VO2 max when you compare somebody who's just sedentary but moving around in comparison to the same people in bed rest. And when you look at the reason for that increase, like how they've managed to achieve that increase in VO2 max, it's all achieved through an increase in this thing called Q, which is a symbol for cardiac output. So they've achieved this increase in VO2 max through an increase in the amount that the blood pumps around the body at peak exercise. So again, delivery related mechanism. Now if we compare the same individuals after they've undergone 50 days of endurance training, well now they've increased their VO2 max even further. So now their VO2 max is pretty much twice what it was when they were under bed rest. And again, if we look at the mechanisms that explain this increase in VO2 max, like how they've managed to achieve it, what we can see is that the vast majority of their increase in VO2 max has again been achieved by an increase in this Q, cardiac output. So the heart has been able to pump faster, which is allowing them to have a higher VO2 max. And only a small proportion of the increase that they've seen is due to an increase in this thing called AVO2 difference, which is basically oxygen diffusion at the muscle. So the amount of oxygen that's been able to be extracted from the arterial blood and then left, or how much has been left in the venous blood. So arterial oxygen, so how much is in the arterial blood, minus venous oxygen, how much remains. And you can imagine the more that you're able to extract might be an indication of your better utilization, although it can also be in changed delivery as well. So this evidence again points to the idea that as we get fitter, the main reason we're able to increase our VO2 max is because of this increase in maximum cardiac output, which is clearly a change in our oxygen delivery as opposed to a change in our oxygen utilization. So as I say, check this paper out. Now, so if we're happy that VO2 max is largely limited by oxygen delivery, the next question is, well, where within the oxygen delivery system does this limitation occur? it could occur anywhere from sort of the atmospheric air through to reaching the mitochondria and all the processes that are in between there. And so we're going to look at it from 2 points of view. We're going to look at this thing called the Fick equation first, and then we're going to go on to consider the oxygen cascade, which, as I said before, is kind of my preferred mechanism of looking at this problem. So we go to the Fick equation. So hopefully you're familiar with this and you've come across this before. So the Fick equation is simply VO2, so V.O2, volume of oxygen consumed per minute, is equal to this Q again, so cardiac output, how much blood is pumped from the heart each minute, times the difference between arterial and venous O2 levels. Now, what we can do, and one of the reasons why this is quite helpful, is because it forms this equation. So we can start to think about how manipulations of each one of these elements is likely to have an impact on VO2 max. So if we think about this Q part of it again, this is what we saw in the previous slide. So the previous slide that was looking at changes in fitness status from sedentary state, after bed rest in comparison to the sedentary state in comparison to a trained state, what it sort of showed was that they were able to increase this cardiac output. And what you can see from the formula is that makes sense, because whatever the number is on this side, on this part of the equation, if we are timesing that by a greater cardiac output, then VO2 max is going to increase by the same amount. What I would like to do now, though, is consider some of the other elements that are going to influence this Fick equation. So we've got cardiac output, and I've sort of drawn a line here and put heart rate under it, because we can imagine that if we change heart rate, we would change cardiac output. Now, there are other things that might impact cardiac output, and I want you to try and recognise them by putting them underneath this sort of part of the equation. But there are also things that are going to influence arterial oxygen levels that I'd like you to sort of draw a line and consider, what factors they might be. And similarly, there might be some factors that are going to influence venous oxygen levels, so how much oxygen is left after the blood's been through, past the muscles, if you like. And what I like to do is sort of draw lines underneath this to see how many parts of this equation are going to be impacted by our physiology, like heart rate and other things. So see if you can have a go at this. Have 3 minutes and just write down these physiological factors that are going to influence these different elements of the equation. So if you could do that now for me, please. Right, so here is a kind of fairly extensive answer, which I wouldn't expect you to know, and I'm only going to go through some parts of it, the parts that I think are most relevant to you. So let's go through some of the easy parts. So hopefully you're fairly happy that cardiac output is dictated by heart rate times by stroke volume. So how often does the heart beat times by how much blood's pumped out of the heart for each beat. And that's going to be a primary thing that's going to dictate your cardiac output. Now, there are also other factors that are important as well. So, your heart doesn't just pump. It doesn't just impact cardiac output alone. It also has to work in concert with your vascular system. And so your vascular system can also impact cardiac output. And so that's what this relates to here. This relates to sort of peripheral resistance, so the resistance that occur within your vascular system. Now, if you have an increase in vascular resistance, that can reduce your cardiac output, and it'll do that by causing a change in sort of stroke volume and heart rate. So they kind of work in concert with one another, but I've just put it in there because it's well worth considering that you can't just increase cardiac output by increasing heart rate or stroke volume. It has to work in concert with a change in the vascular system as well. Now, if we look at the arterial oxygen levels, well, hopefully you might have got some of these. So one of the primary things that's going to influence how much oxygen is in the arterial blood is, how well you ventilate the lung, because that's going to dictate how much oxygen there is going to pass over into the blood. So how well you ventilate the lung is dictated by a number of factors. Again, these ones at the top are related to kind of the efficiency of breathing, but the main ones that I would like you to focus on, or at least get, would be VT, so tidal volume, how much air you breathe in each breath, and then also the frequency of breathing, so how many breaths you take per minute. And between those two, that is going to dictate your VE, so your minute ventilation. There are other important factors which you're less likely to sort of know at this point. So things related to VQ matching, which we're going to talk about a little bit in some of our disease lectures. So VQ matching is the ratio between how much you ventilate and how much you perfuse your lungs with blood. So you can imagine that if you ventilate part of your lung really heavily, but there's not much blood flowing through it, then it's going to be very difficult for that oxygen to move from the lung into the arterial blood. So what an important factor in moving oxygen from the alveolar into the capillary blood is by having an efficient matching of ventilation to perfusion. Now, other factors that are going to influence it are going to be related to diffusion of oxygen across the lung, which are going to be related to surface area of the lung, the thickness of the lung, also how much hemoglobin you have in your blood, because that's going to encourage oxygen to move over into the arterial side of the blood. So all of these factors related to the blood, related to the lung, related to some extent to the circulatory system can all impact the amount of oxygen that you have in your arterial blood. Now on the other side, like how much is left once it's been through, say, the muscle, for example, so these cells that are going to be utilizing that oxygen, well, there are a huge number of factors that are going to influence that as well, but some of the most important ones are going to be what is the mitochondrial content, and also what's the metabolic rate, like how much exercise are you doing. If you're doing more exercise and have the same amount of arterial blood and the same cardiac output, then you're likely to extract more and therefore have less left in your venous blood. So the mitochondrial levels, so metabolic rate is probably the primary thing. Mitochondrial levels, again, matching of blood flow to where the oxygen is being utilized, so kind of like a sort of similar thing to this VQ matching, but the muscle, and then also the diffusion properties of the muscle as well. So I would say this side of things is a little bit more difficult to get your head around, but you should certainly be fairly comfortable with, some elements of the factors that are going to influence cardiac output, and then some of these factors that are going to influence your arterial oxygen levels. Now, what's great about the Fick equation is that, like I said before, you can start to manipulate different elements to kind of consider how it's going to impact your oxygen consumption. So an example of this would be this simple, formula here. So let's say our VO2, if we wanted to work out VO2, let's say we knew our cardiac output. Let's say it was 10 litres per minute. So reasonably high cardiac output, certainly during exercise. And then we times that by this difference between arterial and venous blood. So, a reasonable arterial oxygen content would be about 200 mils of oxygen per litre of blood, minus 130 mils per litre of blood in the venous side. So if you follow that down, that means we've got 10 litres of cardiac output times this 70 mils of mils per litre of oxygen that's being consumed, which leaves us with an oxygen consumption of 700 mils per minute, or 0.7 litres per minute. And so, as I say, you can start to sort of play about with this if you wanted to consider, how altering certain parts of this might be able to kind of impact your VO2. So, example I gave before, increased cardiac output here. So let's say we increase the cardiac output to 15 litres per minute, and everything else remain the same. Well, we can add 50% onto this number, so it would end up being 1.05 litres per minute just by an increase of cardiac output to 15 litres per minute. Right, now that can kind of get complicated, and so now we're going to move on to the oxygen cascade. I really like this because I think it's an intuitive way of considering the factors that are going to impact our ability to transport oxygen. And it does that because it really separates the mechanisms by which oxygen actually transported through the body. So, the way that oxygen moves through the body is not always the same. It alters at these different points within the body. And the oxygen cascade kind of explains this really clearly. So let's have a look at this. So the cascade part of it, so obviously the oxygen is because it relates to oxygen. The cascade part is that when oxygen is moving through the body, the levels of it are always reducing at each stage. It can never go up because everything's being moved like passively. So it always decreases, it cascades down from high levels in the ambient air to really low levels at the mitochondria. But What I'm more interested in is you understanding like each step of the cascade and the mechanism by which we as humans move the oxygen from each step of the cascade to the next. So the first step is ambient air. So we get our oxygen from the ambient air, and we move that oxygen from the ambient air into our lungs, so into the alveolar, through ventilation. So we breathe more. So we ventilate our lungs by breathing in and out, which moves this oxygen from the ambient air into the alveolar gas. And there's a drop here, and there's a drop for a number of reasons. There's a drop because the air's being moistened, which causes a reduction in partial pressure. There's also a reduction because it's getting mixed with CO2 that's being pumped out of the lungs, so the overall pressure is being reduced. But we're not really too fussed about that right now. The main thing is that you understand that to move it from the ambient air to the alveolar gas, we do so through ventilation. Now, at the next step, to get from the alveolar gas, so which is kind of still in a sort of typical form of a gas in your brain, if you like, in the air. Well, now it's got to move over into the arterial blood. And it uses a completely different process of movement. So the ventilation just presents the air to the alveoli, and to move across the alveoli into the vascular system, it has to do so through diffusion. Now, diffusion will be something you're familiar with, this like movement of molecules or gases from high pressure to low pressure, and that's what's happening here. So the air or the oxygen gets presented at the lung, and to move into the blood, it passes through via the processes of diffusion. So ventilation is finished, we now move on to diffusion. So now the oxygen is in the arterial blood. Well, now it's in the arterial blood, as we know, it's getting pumped around the body. So now the mechanism's changed again. It's not diffusing through the body anymore. And once it's in the blood and it's bound to that hemoglobin and it's in your plasma, well, now we're using the heart and the vascular system to actively pump it to where it needs to go. And this pumping mechanism, if you like, this movement of the gases within the blood is called perfusion. So we perfuse the oxygen, or we perfuse the blood containing oxygen around the body, and then specifically into the systematic capillary blood, so to the muscles for our purposes. And then once we present this blood to the muscle tissue, well, again, the blood doesn't move into the muscle tissue itself. So the oxygen doesn't move into the muscle tissue itself through the perfusion. That just presents the oxygen to the muscle. Once it reaches the muscle, it now has to diffuse again from the blood across into the muscle, and eventually ending up at the mitochondria where it's going to be utilized. So the mechanism is back to diffusion again, and then in the mitochondria, that's where utilization occurs. So you can see all of these are distinct from one another, and they explain this process of how this gas moves from really high pressures here in the atmospheric air to really low pressure at the mitochondria. So just to go through those points again, and sort of some of the mechanisms that are going to alter during exercise that impact these. So the first stage was ventilation. And so I'm going to use the word purpose here to kind of try and make the point, but obviously there's no purpose to physiological processes. It's not like a pre-designed thing. But I'm going to talk in these terms to try and make things clear. So for ventilation, so the purpose of ventilation is simply to present high levels of oxygen, so high concentrations of oxygen, to the alveoli surface. So when we ventilate, that doesn't move any air into the blood. All it does is move the air from the atmosphere into the lung, right? And we can sort of aid this movement of air to the lung by doing the things that you're familiar with. So by increasing our minute volume, so how much we breathe in total per minute, which we achieve through either changes in increasing our tidal volume or increasing our breathing frequency. And there's some other bits we can do as well, but primarily that's what we can do and what we can measure. So, from an exercise standpoint, if we want to understand a little bit more about how ventilation is changing during exercise, we can use these three variables to maybe understand that a little bit more clearly. Now the next one is diffusion in the lung. So the purpose of diffusion is to move as much of the oxygen that's being presented at the alveoli into the arterial blood. So it's presented at the alveoli, it can't move by ventilation anymore because it's hit a physical barrier. So its only way of crossing that physical barrier is through diffusion. Now, markers that are suggestive of normal diffusion that we can kind of measure, again, during exercise, well, one of the primary ways of measuring it is by looking at this diffusion capacity for carbon monoxide. So I've put a note of that there, but we can't measure that during exercise, but it's worth you reading up a little bit about it because you may see it in some of your papers that you read, particularly if you're going to read about COPD. But the ones that we can measure in the lab, and what we're going to, or at least measure to some extent, are arterial PO2. So we've got measurements that kind of estimate arterial PO2 with our tests. And so in a normal sort of scenario, our arterial PO2 sits in the range of about 80 to 100 mils of mercury. So we can look at that and know that if arterial PO2 goes down, then maybe that's indicative of a diffusion limitation occurring. The other thing that we can look at, and we're going to use in the labs, is looking at arterial oxygen saturation. So this is the amount of hemoglobin that has oxygen bound to it. Now normally that will sit above 95%, usually above 98%. And again, similarly, if we saw this number decrease, that might be indicative of an oxygen diffusion limitation. So we're going to estimate this, and we're going to measure this in the lab. Now the next step is perfusion. So once that oxygen is now in the blood and it's crossed that membrane, that barrier, well again, it doesn't need to cross any other barriers now because it's primarily bound to hemoglobin. So the next thing it needs to do, it needs to sort of travel like it's in a car or a train to where it needs to go. So the purpose of perfusion is to actively move the O2 from the pulmonary capillaries to the tissue, to the active tissue. So for us, we're primarily interested in the muscle. Now, hopefully you can imagine that the things that are going to allow us to perfuse this oxygen to the muscle are going to be through an increase in cardiac output, but not just cardiac output, and we can do that via increases in heart rate or increases in stroke volume, but also, we need to make sure that we're not only just increasing cardiac output, but we're actually increasing the flow, the amount of cardiac output that's going to the areas of interest. So, for example, increasing leg blood flow and muscle blood flow. So it's not just about pumping more from the heart, it also has to be moved to where it's required. So in our case, usually the active muscles. And then finally, the purpose of diffusion at the muscle is, well, we've moved the oxygen to the muscle through perfusion, and then now it hits another barrier because it's got to cross from the blood over into the muscle and then finally to the mitochondria. And so the way it's going to do that is through diffusion again. So the purpose of diffusion at the muscle is to move oxygen from the muscle capillaries to the mitochondria. And one of the mechanisms we can use to kind of look at that, we can't look at this hugely within the lab, but it's to look at a thing called the oxygen extraction ratio, which essentially looks at how much of the delivered oxygen is being utilised. And so a number of 1 would indicate that we are utilising all the delivered oxygen, and then the lower that number goes, the less the ratio of oxygen that we're utilising is decreasing, kind of indicating that we're not using as much of the oxygen that's being delivered. So you can imagine if we've got a really low oxygen extraction ratio, that might be indicative of an oxygen diffusion limitation at the muscle. So we're delivering lots, but not a lot of it's being utilised, so it's probably not being delivered. It's not being diffused as well as it should be. Now, that's not the only thing. So there are other factors that can influence the oxygen extraction ratio, which I've just put in here. So I'm not going to get into those now. I just wanted to highlight them there so that you have them. So there are several factors that can change this number, one of which is a diffusion limitation at the muscle. Now finally, utilisation. So that wasn't in the cascade because it's mainly about delivery, but it's worthwhile keep highlighting that as well. The purpose of utilisation is to take that oxygen that's presented at the mitochondria and use it for aerobic respiration. And so we're using it in aerobic respiration in order to resynthesize that ATP in order to produce energy, which is the stuff we've been talking about for the last however many weeks. And our best marker of looking at utilization is oxygen consumption. That is what we're looking at. VO2 is the amount of oxygen being utilized or consumed, where we're most interested in the muscle. However, by measuring oxygen consumption, it can also be influenced by any of the factors that we've talked about before. So that is the oxygen cascade. Now, just a quick sort of figure, just to kind of show you the link between these two things, because they're not completely separate, as you can imagine. So this is another schematic of the oxygen cascade, if you like. So we've got ventilation in blue, which is just showing like how we're going to move that air from the atmosphere to the alveoli. And once it's at the alveoli, well, that mechanism now changes to diffusion. So if we want to take that oxygen at the alveoli and move it into the blood, well, now we change it to the process to diffusion. Once it's in the blood, the process changes to perfusion. So this is kind of schematic representing the vascular system, the heart, the lungs here, and the muscle there. So the heart pumps the blood, it diffuses from the lungs into the blood where it's being perfused to the muscle where it's going to get used. Once it's at the muscle, perfusion is no longer helpful. Now it needs to diffuse from the muscle capillaries into the muscle itself, and finally to the mitochondria where it will get utilized again. So we could have some blue here. And if we look at that, well, our cardiac output is the easiest one, is represented by perfusion in the oxygen cascade. So if we want to link the Fick equation to the oxygen cascade, well, the cardiac output part of it is directly linked to perfusion. However, it gets a little bit more complicated when we look at the other factors, because our arterial oxygen levels are going to be impacted by ventilation. If you don't ventilate the lung particularly well, then there's going to be less oxygen here, and therefore there's going to be less that diffuses into the blood, and therefore less that's in the blood, which is where you're going to get your measurement of arterial oxygen content. Similarly, if you ventilate the lung perfectly well, but you've got some issue with diffusion at the lung, let's say because you have a low surface area, well then not as much oxygen is going to pass into the vascular system. So again, that's going to reduce arterial oxygen content, but this time due to a diffusion problem. And then similarly, if you have really poor perfusion in the lung, so you're not delivering enough blood to the lung where it's being ventilated and can be diffused correctly, well then you're going to have a mismatch between your ventilation and your perfusion, which is also going to cause a reduction in your arterial oxygen content. So all of these three factors can influence arterial oxygen content. And similarly, these three factors, so perfusion, diffusion at the muscle, and utilization at the muscle, are all going to impact your venous oxygen levels for similar reasons. If you've got poor perfusion, then it's likely that you're going to potentially, if your perfusion is poor to a certain region, then it's likely to pass through potentially where it's required, and therefore you might get an elevation in the VO2. Conversely, if the perfusion is slow, then you might extract more of the oxygen and therefore cause a decrease in VO2. In VO2. Similarly with diffusion, if you've got completely normal perfusion but you've got an issue diffusing that oxygen into the muscle, well then if it's not getting taken up, it's going to remain in the blood, and so your VO2 is going to increase. So remember, this is vascular O2 levels. And then finally with utilization, if you increase utilization, you're likely to decrease the amount of oxygen that's left within the vascular system, and therefore that number's going to go down. If you've got an issue with utilization, let's say you've got some sort of metabolic disease, then it's likely you're not going to be able to extract as much oxygen from the blood, and therefore you're going to have more remaining in the vascular system following its sort of passage through the muscle. So they all interrelate with one another when you sort of consider it in respect to the Fick equation. So the next question though is, so if we're happy that all of these different steps can be really important, the next question, well, which one is most important when we're considering healthy people? And we come back to this figure that I showed you before from the Bassett and Howley paper, which is actually taken from another study, which you can find by looking at this text. So I've highlighted this again here, and it's not the only study. There are dozens of studies that have shown this similar kind of finding, but what this study essentially shows you is that in healthy people, as you get them to train, that their increase in oxygen consumption is driven by an increase in cardiac output. And that really sort of exemplifies the kind of current theory really about what limits oxygen consumption in healthy people. It is the ability of the heart to pump faster. So if your heart, if you have a higher maximum cardiac output due usually to a higher maximum stroke volume, but can also be heart rate as well, then you are likely to have a higher oxygen consumption than somebody else. So if you compare fit people to unfit people, one of the primary things that differentiates them is a higher and lower maximum cardiac output. And if you take the same individuals and get them to train, the reason that they get fitter is largely due to an increase in their maximum cardiac output. So what we say is that in healthy people, the primary thing that's limiting their VO2 max is their cardiovascular fitness. And that is why you've heard that term so many times before. So the VO2 max test in healthy people is a marker of cardiovascular capacity or cardiovascular fitness. That's why it's called a cardiovascular test, because it's primarily the heart that differentiates between fit and unfit people and trained and untrained individuals. Now that said, well, what about disease? Well, diseases get complicated because they change everything. So again, to give you some sort of severe examples to try and sort of show the point, well, let's say we have somebody with some sort of neuromuscular disease. So I was part of a study that looked at a disease called Charcot-Marie-Tooth, which is essentially an issue with the peripheral nerves supplying the muscle. And those nerves didn't work correctly. And what you see in those individuals is they have muscle weakness, as you can imagine, because they can't stimulate the muscle to contract. But what they also have is low VO2 peak. Because if you can't stimulate your muscle to contract enough, well, then you can't drive the muscle to increase its ATP turnover and therefore its oxygen consumption. So in people with Charcot-Marie-Tooth, this particular disease that I looked at, but essentially all neuromuscular diseases, if they're unable to stimulate the muscle to contract fast enough, then they're going to have a lower VO2 max than someone that's healthy. Now again, you can have someone who has completely normal or fairly normal neuromuscular function, but if they've got a problem with the machinery within the muscle, so let's say something like a muscular dystrophy, well, they're going to have the same because they've got degeneration of the muscle tissue itself, and therefore, it doesn't matter how much they stimulate it and how much energy they're able to provide, that if the mechanical structures of the muscle themselves aren't able to contract at a fast enough rate, then they're not going to be able to produce the power and therefore require the same amount of oxygen and an ATP as somebody who's healthy. So they also have a lower VO2 max. Now we could look at it down here and think about it from the perspective of this ATP resynthesis. Well, this can be impacted by mitochondrial disease. If they've got low levels or poorly functioning mitochondria, then they're going to be unable to resynthesize this ATP, and therefore if they can't resynthesize the ATP, they're not going to have a requirement for the oxygen, so they're also going to have a low VO2 peak. If we look at people with an issue metabolizing food, so this is supposed to say food here, well, I worked with again with a disease population that have a thing called glycogen storage disease. Now in these people, they're unable to break down the glycogen in their muscle and their liver to glucose in order for it to be used for ATP resynthesis. So in these individuals, they can deliver the same amount of oxygen as someone who's healthy. They can have, or at least until they've got had disease for a long period of time, they have normal neuromuscular and muscular systems, but they're not able to break down the food in the same way, so they have low VO2 max due to that. And then we get to the majority of diseases that you're familiar with, which are all issues to do with the oxygen delivery system. So we said that in healthy people, it's primarily an issue with our ability to increase maximum cardiac output. Now, if you can imagine, if you've got a heart disease, well, that's going to be severely impacted because, certainly heart failure is part of its diagnosis is a low maximum cardiac output or cardiac output. So that is going to reduce your ability to deliver oxygen due to that. So heart disease is likely to influence this cog. If we've got lung disease, say COPD or any other lung disease, and that's going to impact, how well you can ventilate or how well air can diffuse from the lungs into the blood. Well, in those individuals, their limiting factor is probably going to be at this part here. They're not going to be able to ventilate and diffuse enough oxygen into the blood, and therefore delivery is going to be limited. So lung diseases might be sort of more around here. And you can have vascular disease as well, which limits your ability to deliver blood through the vascular system where it needs to go. So the limitation in someone with, say, peripheral vascular disease might occur around here. So in disease, the rules sort of change. In health, it's largely due to your cardiovascular system, but in disease, it can be anywhere within that pathway, depending on the nature of the disease itself. So just to conclude, so VO2 max, what have I wrote there? So VO2 max is caused by a limitation in one or more of the sort of systems involved in delivering and utilizing oxygen. Now I introduced the Fick equation, which can be a useful kind of way of understanding it for certain people. I try and promote the oxygen cascade because I think it's really logical to kind of go from oxygen's in the air, it needs to move into the lungs, it needs to move into the blood, it needs to move into the muscle, and then it needs to be utilized by the mitochondria. What are the processes that sort of impact each one of them, so we can kind of do it in this nice systematic fashion. And in health, what the data indicates is that our VO2 peak is limited by our cardiovascular system, which is why it's traditionally been called a cardiovascular fitness test. However, in disease, any part of the system can limit your VO2 peak. So then in certain circumstances, it ceases to be a cardiovascular fitness test because it can be limited by things that aren't related to your cardiovascular system. Thanks for listening. Any questions, as always, post them on the Now discussions for this particular week, and I'll do my best to get to them as quick as I can. See you next time.